accuracy was very poor. As a missile man, I can tell you that their accuracy was one order lower than that of the American missiles.
Soviet engineers were even then working on improving the accuracy of their missiles. But most Western analysts saw them as continuing to pose little first strike threat. A group of outside intelligence experts, called the B Team, disagreed.
The B Team in '76 warned that there would be far more rapid advances by the Soviet Union in the number of MIRV reentry vehicles and in the accuracy of those vehicles than the intelligence community then projected. We felt that there would be a window of vulnerability by the early 1980s.
The idea of a window of vulnerability is that a Soviet strike wipes out the only U.S. missiles accurate enough to attack military targets. Absent the MX, that meant the Minuteman IIIs. With only inaccurate missiles left, like those then on submarines, the U.S. could strike back only against Soviet cities. Rather than risk the inevitable counterstrike against U.S. cities, the president might choose to surrender. It's a highly theoretical argument. For instance, even a Soviet strike at U.S. missiles would kill millions of people with fallout, and itself invite massive U.S. retaliation. But the window of vulnerability argument added new voices to those who wanted a survivable missile. In the Washington of January 1977, however, all arguments for the MX fell short of their target. Jimmy Carter came to office dedicated to arms control and opposed to the MX. The missile's accuracy and war-fighting potential repelled him, and its survivability wasn't important if the intelligence community, the B Team accepted, saw no imminent Soviet first strike threat.
Carter administration came in 1977 and not only ignored the B Team report because it conflicted with what it preferred to view as reality, it intentionally threw the B Team report out.
The MX almost went with it. What saved it was a technological breakthrough in the Soviet Union. In mid-1977, tests began of SS-18s equipped with a new guidance system.
When more sophisticated guidance systems were installed on the SS-18, we discovered to our surprise and to the horror of the Americans that the missile could be used to deliver a first strike.
U.S. monitoring stations quickly discovered the bad news. What had been only a theoretical nightmare suddenly became real.
The evidence suggested that this modification was to make about a twofold increase in accuracy in the missile, and that would achieve a level of accuracy with the size of the warhead on that missile, which could indeed pose a substantial threat to our missiles in their silos. And so that took the vulnerability issue from the back burner and moved it up to the front burner.
And that meant taking a new look at the MX. The Air Force had been doing Congress's bidding in looking for a survivable basing mode, but with little enthusiasm. Now, however, the missile's potential survivability became its biggest selling point. The trouble was, the buried tunnel scheme was looking worse and worse. The Air Force put a team together, headed by General John Toomey, to look for alternatives.
Many of my soldier friends would come to me and say, I don't understand how you guys could possibly work 2 years on finding this concept. He said, I've got the solution. You get these trucks, you put the missiles on the trucks, and then you drive them around the streets of America. The Soviets could never know where they're going to be. And that sort of thing is an example. In fact, Art Buchwald had his solution was Amtrak. We know they'd be safe on Amtrak because nobody knows where Amtrak is at any given time. They're never on time, and their locations are unknown. And that's obviously that's not obviously, but it's probably a workable scheme, except that it violates one of the fundamental constraints is we don't think the American people are going to tolerate having 10 megatons of nuclear weapons driving down the railroad tracks in the center of town and pulling into Union Station.
Toumé's favorite solution was based on the old shell game. The idea was to build a group of simple, inexpensive silos, then move one missile around among them at random. Since the Soviets wouldn't know which silo held the missile, they would have to target them all. Again, blast tests were done to see if the silos could withstand near misses. But for Jimmy Carter, the question remained, why bother with the MX at all? He didn't share the Air Force's desire to add several thousand accurate new warheads to the nation's inventory. And if the only reason for the MX was to ensure the survivability of our deterrent, well, there were the submarines. The new Trident submarines were to get multi-warhead missiles that would give the United States all the retaliatory firepower it needed. If it was so hard for the Air Force to find a basing mode as survivable as the Navy's, why not simply abandon the land-based leg of the strategic triad and leave deterrence to the subs and bombers?
I would say the pivotal argument for proceeding with the MX was that when the President asked Harold Brown and asked myself the critical question, which is, can you assure me that not just today, but 10 years in the future or 20 years in the future, that the submarines will be as invulnerable to attack as they are today, the answer was no. We could not assure him of that. So the President then perceived the specter that if he then narrowed his strategic forces down to simply the submarines, and then if the Soviets were to make a breakthrough in submarine detection, so that the submarines could now be discovered at sea, now you have the most vulnerable system of all, because there's nothing more vulnerable than a submarine if you know where it is.
I've only got one life to live.
But there was another powerful reason for Carter to build the MX.
I will never have a chance so momentous to contribute to world peace as to negotiate and to see ratified this SALT treaty.
He was about to sign the SALT II Arms Limitation Treaty, and he needed the support of his pro-MX Joint Chiefs of Staff to help get the treaty ratified in the Senate.
Ratify this negotiated treaty.
In June 1979, a week before he was to sign the SALT II treaty, Carter reluctantly gave the go-ahead to the MX missile. There was just the little problem of its basing mode.
How is it going to be based?
That will be determined later.
That decision has not yet been made?
No, it's in the process of being made, but the President will decide that in the course of the next several weeks.
There had been disagreement over the proposed missile size. The Air Force wanted the biggest missile allowed under the new SALT treaty, so as to threaten as many Soviet targets as possible. But for those trying to design a survivable basing mode, a smaller missile was preferable. It would be easier to move around and hide. The big missile proponents won. Bill Perry was on the losing side.
I have always believed, but I couldn't prove, that the biggest factor that led to the big missile argument was the anti-wimp factor, which is that it seemed like a wimpy thing to do to build such a little bitty missile when the Soviets had these big, manly missiles.
The choice of the big missile further complicated the basing mode problem. The shell game involved constantly taking the missile out of one silo and moving it to another. It was hard enough getting the much smaller Minuteman in and out of its silo.
And when you start moving around something that weighs 200,000 pounds and is approximately 100 feet tall, it gets rather difficult, it gets cumbersome, it's unaesthetic.
And there was another problem with the shell game. The new SALT treaty would require that each side be able to count the other side's missiles by spy satellite. How could the Soviets know how many MXs there were without also knowing where they were? The answer was yet another basing scheme, the racetrack. The new plan kept the missile horizontal and used a giant transporter to shuttle one missile around among 23 shelters arranged in a loop. Periodically, the roofs of all the shelters would be opened simultaneously, so that a satellite could verify there was only one missile per loop. Then, with all the roofs closed, the transporter would whisk the missile at high speed to any one of the other 22 shelters.
The response to that system was really the response to every MX basing scheme that's ever been made, is there must be a better way, go back and find it. So we thrashed around for maybe another 6 months looking at alternative schemes, and if that one was Rube Goldberg,